Good morning.
Morning.
Welcome to the next in our installment of our Faithful Politics series. This is day 2 of our Solon Cousins lectures, and Dr. Biddle will once again be leading us wondrously through Baptist polity, biblical authority. I got all that. Yeah, you all know what it's about. So glad you're here. Welcome to day 2, and Dr. Biddle.
Wonderful Andy Griffith comedy routine, in which he retells the story of Julius Caesar and his assassination, and comes down to the end. I know at least one of you who knows this. It comes down to the end, and he says that Caesar looks up at Brutus and says, "Et tu, Brute?" in Andy Griffith dialect. And then Andy turns to the audience and says, "Children, I sure hope you all remember what that means." Because I don't. So I hope you all know what I'm talking about. I'm not sure I do. Okay, I can summarize everything I said yesterday in a paragraph. Starting from the assumptions that politics involves the art of living together, and that this art necessarily includes issues of social welfare, economic justice, equality, racial, gender, and otherwise. In our branch of Christianity, we often hear one of two contradictory statements. The first is the statement that the objective and mission of the church is the salvation of souls, not both. The other, that social welfare and social justice issues do not fall within the purview of the state. They are matters for charity and the church, although churches in our orbit do precious little to address such issues. In either case, as is usually true in life, when things fall in the middle, nothing gets done. In the interest of developing a positive position, as a biblical theologian, surprise, my inclination points me to the Bible. By way of reminder, our investigations into Scripture hope to discover answers to a number of questions, including, in no particular order, how we avoid the dichotomy of the two kingdoms approach, what will be the theological foundation or foundations of an approach to citizenship as disciples of Christ. How do we resist the libido dominandi, the urge to dominate? What is the function of government under the kingship of God? Is it merely restraint, or is it the common good? Can Christians participate in government at all, given its dependence on coercion, for example? At first glance, the Bible seems, I'm afraid, to offer little assistance. At best, or contradictory points at worst. As to the form of government that best expresses God's will, the Bible remains relatively silent. Apart from the full realization of the kingdom of God in the age to come, the Bible neither endorses nor promotes a specific political system or form of government. Through a romantic reading of the book of Judges, or at least the first half of it, one could emphasize the quasi-theocratic nature of Israel's system of judges. When Israel found itself in distress and cried out to its God, God raised up a charismatic leader to deliver. Of course, one of Judges' central assertions involves the fact that Israel continually required this deliverance because it continually reverted to idolatry and diverse transgression. The refrain that stamps the conclusion of the book, which relates to horrendous treatment of scores of nameless women, beginning already with Jephthah's daughter. And it also relates to the near eradication of an entire tribe of Israel at the hands of kinsfolk. This refrain attributes this anarchy to, well, anarchy. In those days, the book of Judges says, there was 4 times. There was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So, ecstatic, charismatic, that didn't work. Reading the Bible in chronological order, then, one finds the Israelites' request that Samuel appoint a king over Israel. It seems entirely reasonable given the circumstance. Neither Samuel nor God agreed, however. Samuel seems to have felt the request for a king to be an aspersion on his judgeship, and God considered it a rejection of divine leadership. At God's direction, in any case, Samuel admonished Israel about the tendencies of kings to take, 1 Samuel 8, and later, through Samuel, God offered Israel and its new king a typical Deuteronomistic choice, quoting 1 Samuel 12, verses 14 and 15 in the NRSV. If you will fear the Lord and serve him and heed his voice and not rebel against the commandment of the Lord, and if both you and the king who reigns over you will follow the Lord your God, it will be well. But if you will not heed the voice of the Lord, but rebel against the commandment of the Lord, then the hand of the Lord will be against you and your king. The continuance of the Deuteronomistic history expresses universal condemnation of the Israelite kings, the northern kings, for their apostasy both from God and from the house of David. The eternal divine election of the house of David expressed in Nathan's promise notwithstanding, however, the Deuteronomistic history never settles on a unified and uniform opinion of the Judean monarchy as an institution either. The first king of the Davidic dynasty after its founder violates every prohibition in Deuteronomy's regulations concerning the monarch. Acquiring many horses, many wives, and great wealth. Indeed, as though Solomon had been the topic of Samuel's war. In order to execute his ambitious building program, Solomon took from the people both material and personal resources, resorting even to a policy of forced labor. Bob used the very word of Solomon that is used of the Pharaoh in Exodus 1. Throughout Judah's history, as recorded by the Deuteronomists, two Solomons followed every David. For every Josiah, there was a Manasseh. In the second king, readers find the exiled king Jehoiakim Jeconiah still deposed, still under house arrest, but still alive and eating at the king's table until the day of his death. This description permits scholars to find support for either side of the argument concerning whether the Deuteronomistic history holds out hope for the future of the Davidic monarchy. In fact, except for the brief period of the flawed Israelite and Judean monarchies, the authors of the Bible wrote as occupied or displaced subjects of foreign empires: the Assyrian, the Babylonian, the Persian, the Hellenistic, Ptolemaic, and Seleucid, and the Roman. It was not for them to shape, and certainly not to choose, a form of government. Remarkably, nonetheless, at least until the Maccabees, they were relatively satisfied with accepting this state of affairs as a given. When the Babylonian crisis had yet to reach maturity, Jeremiah referred to Nebuchadnezzar as the servant of the Lord and recommended complete submission to the Babylonian Empire in what some scholars characterize as a policy of realpolitik. After the Babylonians had taken a first group of deportees into exile, Jeremiah wrote them famously recommending that since their futures would be closely linked to that of Babylon, they should seek the welfare of the city. After the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple, and the so-called Great Deportation of thousands into exile, Jeremiah endorsed and aligned with Gedaliah, appointed by the Babylonians to govern the now Babylonian province of Judah, but despised by some as a collaborator. Especially in the Persian period, however, Jews typically found ways to coexist as long as they were free to shape their own cult and to practice it. Deutero-Isaiah celebrated Cyrus the Mede not just as the Lord's servant, but as the Lord's Messiah. In fact, pursuant to Cyrus' famed edict of 539 BCE, a number of returnees to Jerusalem rebuilt the temple there Sometime later, on the authority of the same edict, Ezra brought the Torah to Jerusalem. Moreover, Jewish willingness to cooperate with Persian authority extended well beyond religious affairs. Even Davidites were willing to serve as Persian-appointed governors of the province of Yehud, as it was known at the time. Zerubbabel, Sheshbazzar, Hananiah. In addition to the biblical Nehemiah, archaeological discoveries reveal that non-Davidite, Jewish, Persian-appointed governors of Yehud were the norm during the Persian period. I just like to say these names. Bagohi, Hezekiah, Hananiah, Jehoazer, Ahiab, and Elnathan. Some diaspora Jews even served as in the imperial government back in the capital city, as long as it did not require them to violate their religious convictions. Daniel, Mordecai, Esther, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. Thus, the Bible does not advocate a particular system of government, and certainly not modern liberal democracy. No doubt, many, if not all of you, expect me now to turn to Israel's prophetic heritage. Micah, Jeremiah, and Isaiah, to be sure, issue eloquent and dynamic calls for social justice alongside their calls for covenant loyalty to the God of Israel. But this very covenant context renders their message of little utility for our discussion. Their audiences stood in the covenant tradition and could be expected to respond to its logic. We seek a foundation that can offer theological guidance for our activity in a pluralistic society. The same caveat applies to Judah's royal ideology, the seedling for later messianism. Psalm 72, perhaps the quintessential expression of this hope, ironically headed for Solomon, takes the form of a prayer for the just administration of civil society, the prosperity of the natural order, and ultimately the realization of the promise to Abraham that his descendants will bring blessing to the world order, all to be mediated by the Davidic monarch. Syntactically, the prayer divides into several sections. The first line addresses the deity directly, imploring that the gifts of justice and righteousness be granted the king. The lengthy central section consists of a series of jussive, third-person voluntatures, expressing wishes for the king, for the natural order, and for the world order. Three indicative statements describing the king's just and redemptive acts on behalf of the needy and oppressed interrupt this sequence of justice. The final pair of lines, bless God. I never understood that. Although, what is that? Although they do not make explicit reference to the Davidic monarch. In some, this psalm and others of its genre give voice to an ideal hope, not to a political program. Significantly, they are not songs of thanksgiving for a wonderful king, but petitions, wishes, and blessings, assuming apparently they don't have such a wonderful king. Especially not if it was Solon. Modern pluralistic societies do not occupy a similar stance and cannot be expected, therefore, to submit to calls for covenant fidelity or for allegiance to an ideal Davidic monarch. Another, more fundamental basis will be necessary. To say that the Bible offers little concerning the how of government, however, is not to say that biblical theology has nothing at all to say about the essential structure of human society, including the fundamental principles that ought to shape and guide government. The proper starting point, it seems to me, is to ask again, how does God intend for us to live together? In a real sense, the entire Bible addresses this question. But I will conclude these lectures by arguing that the creation account in Genesis supplies an ample, rich source material for a theology of government that avoids the pitfalls of the approaches we talked about yesterday. Ready? Bible professors. The first element of the creation account with the potential to shape a Christian approach to government is the doctrine of the Imago Dei. In this regard, it is important to distinguish the biblical doctrine from enlightened notions of Enlightenment notions of human rights, as I mentioned yesterday. Rights discourse shares a grammar with capitalism. Just as capitalism assumes the greed of all participants in the marketplace, counting on the greed of one to balance the greed of the other. The concept of human rights assumes the self-interestedness of all participants in society, counting on the self-interest, the right, of one to balance the self-interests of the other. Rights discourse assumes the need to establish boundaries between individuals and society in order to protect individuals from the inevitable encroachment of others pursuing their own selfish interests. Thus, C.B. McPherson equates the political doctrine of human rights with what he calls possessive individualism. The idea that a human being is free and human by virtue of his or her sole proprietorship of his or her own person, and that human society is essentially a series of market relations. Therefore, theologically speaking, the concept of human rights relates primarily to sin, not to the imago Dei. The concept of human rights cannot engender a sense of duty to others, interconnection, interdependence, or mutuality. Furthermore, the freedom promised by the notion of human rights has no objective. It offers freedom from encroachment, but provides no indication of the proper use of this freedom. It is anarchic, non-teleological freedom. Free from, okay. Free for. In contrast, the imago Dei doctrine, whether it presupposes a heavenly council or takes the form of Christian Trinitarianism, grounds humanity in the nature of God. The assertion that God created humankind, significantly, not that he created a human individual, Genesis 1, in God's image, blessing humankind with a charge to multiply, mirrors the community of the Godhead. The implications for a theology of government align more closely with the classical idea that politics is, quote, natural, self-evidently part of human society, or indeed, the most complete expression of human sociality. It aligns more closely with that than with the focus of the Augustinian Lutheran tradition on human sinfulness. In creating, God does not act on God's rights to protect God or God's self from encroachment. To the contrary, rather than withdrawing behind boundaries, God's creative act reaches beyond God's self, bringing other wills into existence. In creating, God does not guard God's safety. God becomes more vulnerable. If politics answers the question of how to live together, God's act of creation can be described as quintessentially political. Until God creates, there is no community beyond God to necessitate togetherness. Just as God creates and maintains, caring for and preserving the community of creatures living on earth, human beings, if they are to image God well, cannot merely insist on protecting themselves from others. Instead, in order to image God, they must create community, caring for other creatures, acting not out of pure self-interest. Boy, that would have been bad. Not with the last word on the page. That would have been bad. That would have been right at all. 1, 3, 3 to the left. In order to manifest a family relationship with God, human beings must be peacemakers, agents of shalom, healthy and vibrant order. This understanding of the imago Dei in political terms, as Wesleyan political theologian Theodore Weber puts it, grounds government theologically in the doctrine of God, or more specifically, in the governing relationship of God to the world. Government, as disclosed in human nature, as political image, is what God does in ordering, preserving, and developing the creation. Thus, human beings can image God, emulate God, and act in analogy to God in the act of shaping human society. This foundation for human politics supports much more positive actions than the hamartiologically grounded, I can write it, I can't say, position that government should function only as a restraint on sin and crime. At the same time, recognizing human sinfulness, it provides criteria for measuring the degree of selfishness tainting human political activity. The natural, egocentric inclinations of fallen human beings can be checked against the character of the Creator God. The biblical account of the creation of humankind in the image of God also establishes the fundamental power structure of human interrelations. Male and female alike bear the image of God. Human interrelationship is non-hierarchical. There is no subordination. The continuation of the account complements this portrayal by means of the mandate to exercise dominion, however. Although it should not seem so to Christians familiar with the gospel story, with Jesus saying, contrasting the tyranny of the rulers of the Gentiles with servant greatness in the kingdom, or with the grand Christological hymn of Philippians 2, the notion of dominion without hierarchy may sound almost paradoxical to many. A final implication of the Imago Dei, an implication developed further in God's blessing, also involves the corporate image of humankind. Not only does this creation suggest something about the complexity of the divine character, but it also suggests that the plurality and diversity of humankind are necessary both to image God and to express the divine will. Pluralism is not to be overcome, but to be embraced as the rich expression of divine diversity. A little bit of comedy here. Since I wrote this, I have edited an issue of the Review and Expositor, which will appear in May, which is on ministry with disabled persons. One of the articles was written by a professor whose daughter was born with microcephaly. And his entire article is about the question that he has had to struggle with theologically about what it is to bear the image of God. We theologians constantly, what is it about us that is godlike? Is it our ability to interrelate with one another? Is it our ability to reason? Is it our ability to create? His daughter can do none of these things. And yet, he wants to maintain, and I think correctly so, that she participates in this image of God concept because she's a human being and deserves love. Right? Now, that has made me rethink what image of God must be. And as I indicated in this paragraph I just completed, I've come to think that it's important that God said, let us create humankind in our image. Because I think it takes us all to approximate a picture of God. If you follow what I'm saying. Not an individual. All right. Back to the text. Immediately after the narration of, but I want to read that last sentence. Pluralism is not to be overcome, but to be embraced as the rich expression of divine diversity. I like it. Immediately, and I'll read it again if you want to. Immediately after the narration. Amen. Now I don't have to. Immediately after of the creation of humankind, Genesis reports that God blessed human beings with a twofold blessing. Commentators often refer to this blessing as command or mandate, overlooking the significance of the fact that God's directive takes the form of a blessing. Indeed, God's primary method of creation, according to Genesis 1, is blessing. English cannot easily convey the logic of the Hebrew jussive verbs God employs in directing the cosmos to come into existence. Consequently, English translations find it difficult to make evident their proximity to blessing. Biblical blessings are not commands, they're not mandates. Yet they are more than wishes, especially when found on God's lips. A simple rearrangement of the sentence, "let there be light," into "light may be," helps, but still falls short of conveying the Hebrew idea. These divine blessings give permission. They authorize. They empower. Light began to shine in the primordial darkness because God authorized and empowered light to come into existence. Sea creatures came to life because God authorized and empowered the sea to produce them. In contrast to the divine blessing upon light, the sea, and the dry land, the blessing for humanity is in direct address. Thus, the blessing both enables humanity to execute it and also calls humanity to do so in free response to the blessing, rendering humanity responsible to God. The blessing grants humanity the freedom to have a history. It also points to a central component of the biblical portrayal of God's sovereignty. In the Bible, God rarely acts as though by divine fiat. I know that's almost tautological. But anyway, instead, God authorizes and empowers entities within creation to cooperate with God, ordaining big fish and Kikyo plants and Sirocco wind. God calls upon the sea to produce living creatures and calls upon the dry land to produce vegetation, and the sea and the vegetation cooperate. God appoints a Sirocco wind to vex Jonah, a Kikyo plant to shade him from the sun, and then a cutworm to return Jonah to his misery. In all this, God authorizes and empowers components of creation to participate in executing God's will in the world. Again, consideration of the political implications of the biblical account of the creation of humankind returns to the same themes of vulnerability, cooperation, and service. The first substantive element of the blessing for humanity authorizes humankind to join animal life in populating the earth. As is true of the Imago Dei, this mandate is not addressed to individuals, but to corporate humankind. Likewise, as implied in the creation of corporate humankind in God's image, the authorization to fill the earth anticipates plurality and diversity. In fact, a recent trend in the interpretation of the Tower of Babel episode calls attention to the fact that not only did the people on the plains of Shinar foolishly attempt to secure a name for themselves, but they also represented the entire human race at the time, massing together rather than spreading throughout the earth to fill it. Arguably, then, God's decision to confuse their language indicates that God authorized more than the diversity of individual human traits. God blessed humanity in its cultural diversity as well. The world's plurality of cultures pleases God. From a Trinitarian perspective, humankind best images God when it manifests harmony or unity in difference, not when it manifests unanimity. The second substantive element of the blessing authorizes humankind to order human life within certain boundaries. In other words, through the mandate to subdue the world, God left structuring human society to humans. Nay, God enjoined it. There is no divinely ordained sanitation system. It is not a sin to drive on the left side of the road if you're in Britain. God expects such variation. But these differences are a diaphora. They don't matter. They're like blue carpet or red carpet. They're byproducts of humankind's God-given freedom to order its own affairs, as long as these efforts do not produce disorder. Notably, in this respect, the fertility motif appears in God's blessing on fish and birds, but not on land animals. The omission avoids the impression that humans and land animals must compete for resources. There's to be harmony. This omission is consistent with the commission of humanity to exercise dominion over the earth and its animals. As you know, the history of the interpretation of this blessing has often been perverted into a curse. Norbert, control, dominate. Norbert Lothink has suggested translating kabosh to take possession of, to reflect its etymological origins. It means set foot on, analogous to our lay hands on. So, not to dominate, but to take possession of. Calling attention to usages in Numbers 32, Klaus Kolk suggests the translation in German, gestalten, which I would say configure. Similarly, Zinger points to usages of radah, the other verb in the blessing, that denote the activity of a shepherd with the flock. The Akkadian cognate means to command, guide, lead. Since, however, any human cultural activity does some violence and tending flocks may require force to protect weaker animals, Magdalena Fretlow doubts the idea of human dominion can ever be entirely free of its violent connotation. It can be limited, however. Humanity's exercise of dominion is not unrestrained. Genesis 1, 29 and 30 prescribes different foods for the animals and humanity to prevent competition. More importantly, in God's original intention, I don't know how many of you have noticed this, we're supposed to be vegetarian. Supposed to be. I like that here. Human beings are to exercise dominion over the world without the shedding of blood. Of course, the biblical story of humankind hastens to the episode involving the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, narrating how the first pair failed fully to trust God, and thereby introduced shame and mistrust into the world. Blessing became curse. Now, because of their selfishness, the intended reciprocity and equality between genders gave way to hierarchy and subordination, even to pain in childbirth. Now, because of their misuse of the garden will resist their efforts to manage it, turning wholesome work into toil. But Dr. James Young Simpson introduced chloroform as an anesthetic for use in childbirth in 1847. Many prominent East Coast clergymen objected that it circumvented the curse imposed upon women after the fall. Male clergy. Mm-hmm. I said clergymen. There were only clergymen in those days. Many conservative Christians employed the same argument a generation ago with respect to race relations, and others still later with respect to the objectives of feminism and women's rights. As we discussed yesterday, many established Christian theologies of government operate largely on the acceptance of the fallen state of humankind as a fundamental factor. We are fallen, we are under curse, that's the way it's supposed to be. According to them, government functions primarily to protect the innocent from the encroachment of evildoers, to restrain sinners, to enforce the curse. My question asks whether God raised Jesus Christ from the dead in order to enforce the curse or to lift it, restoring mutuality and reciprocity, ending mistrust and shame. The first 3 chapters of Genesis tell the story of the creation blessing and human accursedness. The Bible does not end the story there, however. By Genesis 12, God has called Abraham and his descendants to be the avenue for returning the blessing to all the families of the earth. And the biblical story becomes the tale of redemption. With regard to a theology of government, these observations raise the question of whether such a theology should be rooted in the doctrine of creation, the doctrine of sin, or the doctrine of redemption as the restoration of blessing. I joined Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who argued that just government strains toward redemption, and that blessing is God's possibility for saving the world, although it requires human mediation. People who bless recognize the difference between what God wills and what actually is. By blessing, they promise that God's will can become, and they contradict those who desire the status quo. Blessing aims at redemption. The righteous meet injustice and violence not with hatred and retribution, but with blessing. They can do so only because they have been blessed. Magdalena Fretlow, in her wonderful study of the biblical concept of blessing, that's not been translated in English, I'm sorry, observes, so this is my translation, that only where human beings appropriate the dominium terra, the domination of the earth, as a blessing, that is, only when they understand it, not as an exercise of their own power, but as a mandate empowered by God, when they respect the boundaries established by God, and as images of God, give structure to God's dominion as human dominion on earth, without the shedding of blood and without hierarchy. Only then can they prove to be a blessing to the community of creation, consisting of all living beings. To conclude, this approach to government also holds potential as a framework for Christian, non-Christian dialogue in the realm of the common good. Since its roots in the creation blessing places it under the heading of natural revelation or natural law. So, Protestant theologians, in particular, tend to undervalue the biblical witness to the utility of the wisdom view of the world. Barth's famous aversion to natural revelation, although understandable in historical context, as a reaction to Nazism's amalgamation of the Darwinian concept of the survival of the fittest, Nietzsche's Übermensch, and the pseudoscience of Arianism. Even though I understand it, this aversion is tantamount to a rejection of Proverbs 8, Romans 1, and an assent to John, which I can't. In fact, its effects have been lasting, beginning with the almost total silence on Israel's wisdom traditions in Old Testament theological circles. I'm sorry to say. Barth's concerns were soteriological. What constitutes saving knowledge of God? My concerns in these lectures lie with the structure of human society, how we live together. Briefly stated, I would like to work backward from Paul's understanding of a universally available nomos, John's understanding of the divine logos active in creation, which in turn picks up on the image of the divine chokmah from Proverbs 8. I'd like to work backwards from that to Amos's assertion that even those outside the covenant tradition have a concept of what it means to live together. You remember Amos 1 and 2. Paul's discussion of nomos in Romans employs the term with at least two connotations, it seems to me. The universally available law that God incorporated into creation, and the specification of the details of this universal in the revealed Torah. Thus, he argues, substituting Torah for nomos when the context seems to require it. And I'm paraphrasing then, Romans 2:14. When Gentiles who do not possess the Torah do instinctively what the Torah requires, these, though not having the Torah, are a nomos to themselves. Half of you couldn't explain. There's the other half of it. What? All right. Or you can take my Bible. Yes. I know how to get amens for that. The prologue of John's Gospel employs another vocabulary to make essentially the same assertion, with the exception that John boldly identifies the principle of order designed into creation with the to-be-incarnate Christ. The true light that enlightens every person was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him. John's assertion, in turn, manifest a clear line of development back to Proverbs 8, the grand celebration of Lady Wisdom. The personification of the principle of order, both physical and moral, that God employed in creation and incorporated into it, and which is available to any who will seek. The book of Amos begins with a series of oracles addressed first to Israel's neighbors. Although Amos does not elaborate the doctrine of natural revelation, these oracles would have no rhetorical force apart from the assumption that every human being and every human society has some understanding of basic morality. An understanding available only through the design of the world, and especially the design of human beings. The sting of Amos 3 for the Sumerian audience comes from the accusation that although Israel was party to the covenant and knew its Torah, the Egyptians and the Assyrians had a better working concept of right and wrong. God created the world to be rich and diverse. God blessed humankind for mutuality, interrelationship, and reciprocity. God granted humankind the freedom and the responsibility for shaping its cultures and forging its history. Human misbehavior perverted and perverts the blessing into curse. The church and its members can participate in reversing the curse. The church can see what should be and cooperate with God to bring it into being. Although the church and the state are not and cannot be coterminous, they're not the same thing. Christians can enter into dialogue with a pluralistic culture through a creation blessing discourse. We can do so as beings in the image of God, appealing to other beings in the image of God, making peace, not just longing for it. By acknowledging the image of God in all others, we can work within a cultural and religious plurality to call those others to image God more fully themselves. As seen in the best image of God, the model for humanity, Jesus Christ. The institutional dichotomy between church and state is necessary. The supposed dichotomy between the spiritual work of the church and political aims is tantamount to a rejection of God's first blessing and original mandate. I'm done. We have about 15 minutes for questions or comments. Please. Right.
Can you read that last one? Yeah, there you can.
Yeah. Not only can I, but I will. The last line has the word mandate. You mean the last? Okay. The institutional dichotomy between church and state is necessary. The supposed dichotomy between the spiritual work of the church and political aims is tantamount to a rejection of God's first blessing and original mandate.
Is this incredible?
It probably will be. It would be the first thing I ever spent this much time writing that didn't get. But I haven't found a published for it. I haven't looked for a published for it yet. I wanted to read it aloud before I put it out there for the world to see. But I'll make a manuscript available to anyone who would like to see it.
I'm going to continue with my amens all the way through. I didn't realize you were quite so idealistic. We've had for years all these commiseration sessions. Apparently, you've just been humoring me. I have to deal with that. But otherwise, it's very compelling, very hopeful, positive, redemptive approach, and beautifully done. I love the creation emphasis.
Bud coming.
Well, yeah, I'm not going to go on. Well, but just the Genesis thing, because there is a lacuna that I need to help.
Okay.
The Genesis 1 through 3, great stuff. And I'm not that terribly bothered by what Adam and Eve did. It didn't work out well. It seems. And your rereading of Babel, I think, terrific. Okay, and then on to Abraham.
But I skipped Noah.
God did you? Okay, which is a little more than just a hiccup along the way. That's just about blew it all.
Yeah,
well, like this.
Yeah.
And then little. So I'm a little bit. Well, I understand Martin, and I'm not a particularly huge Bardian fan, but yeah, that was bad.
I mean,
something here is evil, and it's that. Ooh.
Yeah,
Something's got to be restrained.
Restraint.
Well, since that was the opposition.
Yeah. But I don't think that restraint is out of. I wouldn't say that restraining evils is something that we should just abandon, because the world is full of stuff,
and it can go too far.
And it can go too far. But if we act as though that's the only job for government, then that explains why there is so much evil in the world. To use a historical example, I've always thought that World War II was avoidable by more of a blessing approach to world history and world affairs than a punitive approach to the Germans after World War I, which was a stupid war to get into anyway, on and on and on and on. We create for ourselves situations that we have to then come in and fix by coercion because we aren't blessing enough beforehand. So I wouldn't say situations don't get out of hand such that you have to have a police force. I would say you can be more proactive in creating community and mutuality and opportunity and all that sort of stuff. And you can have a small police force. And the kingdom of God is yet to come, but we can act more like we're really looking for it than we sometimes. We can more
with the Noah story.
We can see. Yeah, the Noah story. I would be aligned more with Jewish interpreters of the first part of the Bible and say Genesis 3 wasn't it.
Yeah.
Genesis 3 started it. Yeah. Right. It probably reached its climax actually with the flood.
Yeah.
When God's complaint was all that Hamas, all that violence. Yeah. Right. It is after the flood, by the way, and only after the flood, that God makes allowance for human beings to eat meat. So long as the blood is, and life in the blood is handled properly. So that continues to be a concern of God. That taking life is, okay, I'm going to permit it under certain circumstances, but it's not a good thing. It's not God's will. And if you think, the peaceable kingdom we're going to have, we read about in Isaiah, the lions and lambs and everything are going to be vegetarian. That's an interesting concept. But the idea that life takes other life in order to live bothers the Old Testament. And me too, although, it doesn't seem to bother my stomach. Other questions or comments? Oh, shoot, I tried to stir up controversy. Please, see if question.
Well, we do live in a pluralistic society, and not everybody in society is going to buy into that we should live into and this redemptive idea of the blessing. There will always be people who reject that, and there will always be people who
well, that's not true.
Well, I'm not. But I don't know. And maybe this is just I am too polluted by the ideas of the Enlightenment, but I do feel like that the restraint is necessary, and every time we remove restraint,
it's interesting to me that y'all are focusing on that so much. I think of it as left. It'll be human sinfulness is going to be right I'm not talking about a program to convert the world. I'm talking about what should Christians do? What should be our motivation? What should be our governing principles? What are our hopes for engaging in political activity? Right? And in another lecture, I would say that if the church behaved this way, we would attract more people to Christ. But this is not a lecture on evangelism. This is a lecture on how do we engage in politics? And I assume that there are going to be those who don't agree with or that don't stand in the covenant tradition, right? But that didn't bother Amos. That didn't keep Amos from arguing that they should know better than slicing open pregnant women in order to gain territory, right? He didn't stop and give some philosophical lecture first to the, Damascus so that they were on the same. He assumed that human beings have a sense of blessed order of creation. The details may differ, but he assumed that there's a way to talk to people about being a decent human being, whether they're Baptist or not, right? And that's the realm in which I want us to work. Now, we are thinking, as Christians, we're thinking about God's blessing. We're thinking about redemption. We're thinking about Christ on the cross. But we can live that out in the world without being ashamed of it. We can live it out, I believe, in the world in a way in which we expect the world to be able to understand what we're saying without agreeing. Hey, do you understand what I'm driving at? You understand it, but you're not satisfied.
I think that it is. I guess my concern would be is that it is a wonderful place to start, and it is a wonderful place for us to root ourselves in having the conversation. But at the end of the day, I am concerned about my Jewish brothers and sisters who are subjects to anti-Semitism in Europe, and I'm concerned about my Palestinian brothers and sisters that are subjected to brutal violence in the occupied territories. And I'm concerned about my Druze brothers and sisters that are being eradicated by ISIS in Syria. And there comes a point in time where inaction is its own violence.
See, you've heard things I haven't said. You've heard a number of things I haven't said.
Well,
I would take from all of this that we're going to take the next steps and what our role is after we heard this. And yes, it's great. Woo-hoo. So what's next? And that is that as Christians, and especially as Baptists, we put up this wall between church and state. But the reality is that we can't. And as Christians, we need to challenge our government structures and challenge our churches and our local communities to say, is this how we live in community? Is how we're doing it okay? And if it's not, then we make the necessary changes to live out this blessing and this mandate that God has given us.
Something like that.
One more question.
There's a question from the outside.
Yes. And this is a good one to end on. Many vocal evangelicals still hold to the idea of manifest destiny and call for the U.S. to return to a Christian nation by electing godly leaders who will legislate our morality. Godly leaders is in quotes, by the way. Any suggestions on how we can have a productive dialogue with these folks?
My dialogue with them would be historical. It wouldn't be theological. Return to what? Return to where we never were. How do you return to a place you've never been? And the answer is you don't. And by the way, yesterday, one of my most prominent quotations was John Leland. And I would remind us Baptists, the notion of all that is just anathema, right? Which is why Baptists, rightly understood, are not evangelicals. I just heard Glenn Henson in my ear. So I said it out loud. No, I would talk with these people, but I would not be interested in I would be interested in changing their view of American history, if I did. One more, right up there.
From a Baptist point of view,
Mm-hmm.
from a Baptist church government point of view, talk about hyper-individualism.
Mm-hmm.
I've got one vote, you've got one vote. How do you see this playing out in the church's politics?
Yeah, one of the things and I'm only beginning to think about this at this stage in my life. One of the things I don't think circumstances are forcing us to learn what plurality and pluralism means better than we've ever known it before. But again, if you think historically, the South I grew up in was an aberration for a brief period of time. And you know the South I grew up in the South where if you weren't a Baptist deacon, you couldn't get elected to the city council. Just forget it. All the separation of church and state stuff I've talked about, Baptists talked about when I was growing up, but we did not practice it locally. Right? And we're as our subculture and our culture abroad. Globalism is meaning that the world is in my neighborhood now. Right? And the world has always been there. The proportion of Muslim to Christian hasn't changed that much in the last several hundred years in terms of the world's population. It's just that now the world lives in my neighborhood. And that can appear threatening, or it is an opportunity, of which I think it's up to us to decide. I do think that cultural diversity, I do think everything I've said today, I do not think God was interested in a monoculture on the earth. I don't think there was any interest in that. Then there wouldn't be all those wonderful languages to study. All those different cheeses. Well, I rest my case. You know. You said that. I think we're out of time. I thank you for your time.
Dr. Biddle, thank you. Thank you for these 2 days and some wonderful dialogue. Thank you all for being here and engaging with that as well. I want to remind you that we do have one more in our Faithful Politics series, and it will be on April 16th. We're kind of going to zoom in on a more local level, and Dr. Allison Geist-Johnson from STVU down the street will be here talking about engaging locally and how we do that as a community. So I encourage you to be here for that. It will follow our coffee conversation format. So April 16th at 13th, excuse me, at 11:30 right here.
If you all want to be here on Saturday.
Yeah, yes, don't. Okay. All righty. As we go, don't forget lunch is outside, and so let me bless that for us as we go. Gracious God, we thank you for a good opportunity to dialogue together. And God, we pray that this dialogue encourages us, challenges us to live more faithfully as citizens of your kingdom, but as citizens of the country in which we live and the communities in which we live. So God, as we go, give us boldness, help us to be faithful to all that you have called us to be. We pray that you would bless our conversations that we will continue to share, and bless the food that we're about to share together as well. It is in Christ's name we pray. Amen.